Thanks, Adina.
Yeah, thank you. That was very generous. Some people would say I've caused misdirections. And we're going to make fun of each other's wardrobe. So on the way here, I drove up with my daughter. She's wandering around out there. And I listened to a podcast about the power of procrastination. It makes you more creative. We'll see if that's true. So I was reading a natural history, a blog by a woman who I read a fair bit, is Jennifer Fraser, who does it for Scientific American, a natural history blog. And the title of it is Natural History is Dying. And she gives a lot of data there, as well as some beautiful writing. But she points out that in 1950, when you got a bachelor's degree in biology, the median number of organismal courses you had to take was 2.5. In 1960, it was 2 courses. Now, today, the median number of organismal courses you take as an undergraduate to get a bachelor's degree is 0. And those of us, I'm at a university, I head up an environmental institute. The ecology program comes to me and begs me to hire organismal people, although it's kind of pathetic that they can't make the case to hire organismal people. But I think that's a national trend. Reference collections are at different universities have shut down and moved and are being concentrated. It's very hard to keep field stations funded. We're doing it, anybody who's been a field station director or raised money for them, it's tough. You know, courses, just field trips, even at high school level, field trips for a variety of reasons. When I was in high school, field trips were commonplace. They're not commonplace anymore. In spite of this, the weird thing is that I think we're all natural historians. There's an innate, we have 100,000 generations as hunter-gatherers. That's imprinted on us. That's, you know, what I say is in night when, you know, when you're out there and some of the hair at the back of your neck stands up, that's you as prey. But we're all, if you teach, I teach mathematics classes and I've taught field biology classes. And if I want to feel good, I teach a field biology classes because I change people's lives, and those kids write me for 5, 10, 15, 20 years afterwards. I can tell you that nobody that's taken a mathematics class from me has ever written me afterwards. So we know all this. Well, part of the problem, I think, is that our stories, our trope is wrong. We lament loss. We bemoan degradation. You know, we're Debbie and Donald Downers. And I think we have to find a way to make natural history not just more inclusive and broader, but relevant and interesting in ways we haven't even thought of. And one of the ways I think we can do this is to expand our, it should no longer just be natural history about native species and about untouched ecosystems. In fact, there's huge opportunities for wonderful natural histories about non-native species and highly perturbed ecosystems that people will find amazing. So, to give you some numbers, there's 1,359 documented extinctions since the Ice Age. 1,359 documented extinctions. We've domesticated 740 species. I mean, those are new species, those domesticated species. We've moved 900 around, and there's all sorts of stories, amazing stories of species of what, you know, there's a mosquito in the London Underground that's evolved in the last 60 years. It's a whole new species of mosquito. There's 4,000 coyotes in Chicago right now. There's coyotes breeding in the Bronx. Okay? There's the story of the mus musculus, the house mouse on Gull Island in the Atlantic, maybe less than 100 years ago, jumped off a British ship. That house mouse it's a terrible thing for conservation because there's millions of seabirds there. That little house mouse is doubled in size, eats 1/5 its body weight. It's like a monster from a horror movie. But at the other hand, it's an amazing natural history story. The evolution in that mouse is just, if you've ever seen pictures of it and all the carcasses, it's just incredible. You know, orangutans. Our story of orangutans is that they're just in forest. Orangutans are thriving in oil palm plantations now. Our natural history story about them is frankly wrong. We got their natural history story wrong. And we got the natural history story for their threats wrong. We could talk about that later, why we got it wrong about what's going on with them. So I think, you know, exciting people, not just about the natural history in places untouched, but the natural history it's fair, understanding how wildlife is interacting with humans is an important thing, and how adaptable they are. In Laguna Beach, they sit there and they kill and poison coyotes because they don't like the coyotes taking their pets. Well, what's happening? What's going to adapt there? When I went to school, sort of an interesting story is two of my best friends were living together at a time. They were a couple. And one of them went on to reshape coevolutionary biology. Her name is Mae Berenbaum. She's actually a very good naturalist. She's written all sorts of books. She studied wild umbellifers along railroad tracks and along roads. She didn't have a car. She didn't have a driver's license. And that's where she studied them. Her partner, Mark Rauscher, studied coevolution in the Big Thicket in Texas. They used to have heated fights. It was like a married couple. They'd have fights about, Mae, you can't learn anything about nature by studying weeds along railroad tracks and roadsides. Mae did more for understanding coevolution than probably anybody in the last 50 years. More for understanding coevolution and by studying them in those systems. No question about it. Even though she was initially ridiculed about how you're going to learn anything about nature. I have my arguments with my colleagues at UCLA, where we have a big push to inventory biodiversity. I think that's a great thing. But they're not inventorying invasives. Or we do what we call landscape genomics. And we do all these studies of how genomics are varying in space, but they're not doing it on invasives. They should be doing it on invasives at the same time, because there's really interesting things going on there, and you could tell stories to what's going on in LA and cities and disturbed environments. So I think we're missing an opportunity there. Jon.
Well, thank you all. It's been wonderful to be here the last day with you all up here, and Adina takes me back to that dusty creek side and outside of Austin, Nevada, in the middle of the Great Basin, and thinking, that looking at the dust on my boots here and thinking that, these places where you get dust on your boots and you have these surprising conversations and learning things, whether it's from postdocs out there or from the ranchers who are living there, or the Forest Service folks who are, who are out there. These are some of this is the stuff that I really love, like being out there and talking to folks, and thinking that I think I met Peter under similar circumstances along the Columnist River when and as you can imagine, for somebody who likes to have their ideas sort of shaken up and questioned, meeting somebody like Peter, who then became a source for me over the years as a journalist. And now it's great to have this opportunity to work together and to be here together talking with you all, because I think everything that you guys are doing is super exciting around California. When I first met Peter, I was really interested in this question. I'm still interested in it. It's still not quite. It's not resolved, and it may not be resolved ever as we think about conservation on a changing planet. I was interested in how do we measure the success of conservation, and the Nature Conservancy was very involved with trying to figure this out and having a hard time doing it. And it became a story that became part of my own research, and that I can continue to be interested in for going on 2 decades now. There was another part, in addition to measuring the species or communities in time and in space, and how successful are you in conserving these things that you're concerned about persisting into the future or thriving, and that was the measuring the success of conservation organizations themselves. And all of the conservation organizations that I talked to who were interested in these questions, the Nature Conservancy, the Wildlife Conservation Society, WWF, and others, were concerned about another data point, which was the widespread crisis in conservation and environmental organizations. And it's not contemplating the 6th mass extinction, and it's contemplating their own future in seeing their base of support possibly disappearing and not connecting to new audiences, to new constituencies in the 21st century. What's interesting about this, I was also been on the board of the California Historical Society, and it's not just conservation organizations, so you can take a deep breath. You're not alone. A lot of nonprofits, a lot of 20th century institutions are facing the same crisis of how to engage a young, increasingly diverse, urban audience that doesn't engage in the same way as generations before might have with conservation organizations. Maybe doesn't respond to the same tropes and stories, that we need to think about new ways of telling these stories. But at the same time, I've come to really learn and appreciate that there's good reason for hope, especially in California. As we look at the changing demographics of California and polls and votes over the last 20, 30 years, every major environmental bond or measure that is passed in California, all the polls that have been taken have shown that it's because of the support of people of color. It's because of the disproportionate concern of Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans for the environment and their willingness to pay through taxes, through ballot measures, to support the protection of the environment. But there's still an enormous concern about the long term, about real long-term meaningful engagement. And we know how to mobilize voters for a particular ballot, how to get messages out, how to get people to the polls, but that's not enough. And we see that in California today with leaders and communities beginning to question, of whether we voted for these things, but are we seeing the benefits in our communities? And those are very real concerns. And concerns about how long that support will last, and will we have a conservation movement that defined California in the future? So there's growing support for the realization that conservation must change to connect, and fortunately that doesn't have to be invented. It's already happening. Southern California is a hotbed for this, but it's true all over. Organizations led by people of color, like the Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust that you'll hear from this afternoon, Latino Outdoors, among others, and they need and deserve our support. They're changing what conservation and environmentalism mean, and that's not just okay, it's good, it's great. And it's not just me saying this. There's a lot of the major philanthropies that are seeing this and investing in it. And if you think about it, what could it mean for the movement to embrace the communities that are most ardently concerned about and supportive of conservation and the environment and engage in the long term so that their preferences are heard? By the way, it's becoming part of the law. We saw this in the recent climate change bills that were passed. We saw it in Proposition 84, the last big bond that was passed, Proposition 1, that's becoming part of law that we really pay attention to these concerns. They're real. And so from watching and listening and getting to know you all, I think California Naturalist is in a remarkably good and perhaps unique position to embrace and celebrate that change, and to be a real living bridge between the generations and ensure that conservation expands and thrives and succeeds in the 21st century. So thank you all for that. And I think what I'd like to do with Peter is talk about what are some of those big ideas that are part of this the new approaches to conservation, the new thinking about conservation. We'll talk for a little bit and then want to really have a conversation with you that'll continue through the afternoon and into the evening. One of the big ideas that's batted around, Peter, I know you've written about this, is the Anthropocene. And what is that? What do you think of when you think about the Anthropocene and what that means for conservation today?
So I think to some people what the Anthropocene means is that sense of loss and the sadness of species that have disappeared. And I get that. That's legitimate, especially for our generation. That doesn't work for the next generation because it's done. It's over. It's done. It's accusatory. It's not hopeful. Conservation should be futurist and not nostalgic. And so when I think one of the biggest things that's happened, and you'll see this with every NGO, it started when I was at the Nature Conservancy, pretty much every conservation NGO is engaging in the urban environment in a serious way. They're caring about what wildlife is in urban settings. They're caring about how different communities interact with nature in urban settings. They're caring about accessibility. How hard is it to get to a park? And that is a change. 10 years ago, the Nature Conservancy would have never talked about anything about cities. Now they talk a lot about cities. That would be one good big idea.
So when we were both at the Ecological Society of America in Baltimore last year, and in many ways, I mean, it seemed like that was a kind of coming out, a debutante ball, or it was the arrival, like urban ecology had really arrived. I mean, there were standing room only sessions running almost throughout the whole conference that were focusing on urban ecology. It was as if, Travis Longcord said earlier today that, when he first started working on urban wildlands, that people said, "What are you, crazy? If you want to study nature, you should be somewhere out there." And he said, "No, this is interesting here. We need to understand nature here in the city." But it was also, I got the sense also at the ESA that, and some people said this explicitly, that when you're looking at urban ecology, it's really kind of shaking things up, because a lot of the theories, what we might even call the laws, don't necessarily apply. We're going to have to, is that how you think of it as well? I mean, this is kind of new territory for understanding how nature functions in cities?
I think much of ecological theory, at least, is based on this sense of a long history of accommodation of species, accommodating to one another, coevolution, and what those relationships mean. Cities are disruptive. There's whole different principles. It's much more about dynamism, flexibility, and adaptability. And those would be the things you would be studying in urban ecologies, like, what is it with those 4,000 coyotes in Chicago? Are they different species?
Well, and I think that it's interesting about that research. It's Stan Garrett's research in Chicago, I mean, showing that, I think the thing that surprised me about that research, and kind of, one of these things that you learn and sort of shakes you up, is that Chicago is not a sink for coyotes or for populations of coyotes, as we often think of cities or disturbed landscapes as they're potentially sinks for species. Species don't thrive there. These are not great places. They might thrive in other places, but they go there to die or to dwindle. But that Chicago, the city of Chicago, is actually a source for coyotes in the surrounding countryside.
Yeah. Pretty soon Bronx is.
It's crazy. It kind of turns your mind around. I guess that the other part of urban ecology that we've talked about in other sessions, here, is that it's important to do this research where people are. That 95% of Californians are living in urban areas, and that for people to connect to nature, you need to understand and think about and engage with nature where they live.
And and not just that, we're going to have to be better listeners. So we often think about it from the point of view of how are we going to teach these new communities to love what we love? That's not the right point of view. We need to listen to what they love about nature. It's different. There's been a lot of research, some it was done at UCLA. Social. Go to Instagram, so you could do an analysis of Instagram pictures and compare the white community to the Hispanic community, totally different Instagrams of what they're doing at the national parks in California. The Hispanic community is social, family engagement. The white community is pictures of landscapes. Okay? So we need to think, and we need to listen. One of the things that Nature Conservancy had that just blew my mind is we had this program called LEAF, and we took inner city, really pretty often disadvantaged kids from New York City, and now it's in 20 cities all over, to work as research assistants on our lands. And it was all about how we were going to change their lives, and we did change their lives. The leader of that program had the foresight to hire social scientists to see how they interacted with the TNC staff. The bigger impact was how they changed the Nature Conservancy staff. It was a bigger impact on how those kids who listen to different music, who are just so different, changed, and sometimes disrupted the staff in a way that was uncomfortable, changed the staff, changed you guys. That was a bigger impact than how we changed them.
And was that, I mean, did I go around, I think I'm excited about these changes. I think it's going to be great for conservation, and so I'm very optimistic now, whereas 10 years ago or 15 years ago I was kind of more worried about that. But I think, that the way that conservation is going to change, that the environment is going to change, what it means is going to change, and that's going to be cool. Did TNC come to think that, or is that?
I'm not so sure. There are a lot of interviews, and this thing's available if anybody's interested in it. For some people, it was not a pleasant experience, and in some cases, the kids had to be taken out of the staffs. It didn't work. It didn't always work. But by and large, I'd say in 3/4 of the cases, it was a very positive experience, but not always.
So there's another, we just, this summer I've been doing a survey and some research using traditional survey methods, but also harvesting social media to look at coastal access in California. Who goes to the beach, why they go to the beach, what they enjoy about the beach, and coastal parks, to try and understand better California's relationships with the coast, which I imagine many of you know is, there's been a lot of kind of controversy recently about our coastal commission, and is it out of touch, and these things. And so we're interested in learning more about that. And I came with the kind of hypothesis that we were going to see some of these interesting differences that we've seen in some cases in people's preferences for parks and the things that they do in parks, and that have to do, that are often there, you can see different ethnic differences. But what again, what kind of blew me away, and sort of going out and doing research and the data you get, and then it changes the story, was that these are very preliminary results. So please don't quote me, but I think they're so robust it would like knock my socks off. That across ethnicity and income, the primary things that people want when they go to the beach and the coast are very similar.
And what are they?
They want a clean beach. They want to see clean water. They want a place where their kids can play and they can relax and enjoy the scenery. They want to be able to get there fairly easily. It's a little, they want parking or public transportation close by, and then as it goes down, it goes down the list, you see more variation in the small numbers. But it was kind of that was a really interesting thing to see that, in some cases, what we care about and about the environment, an environment that's super important to our identity as Californians, is really shared.
Yeah, it's not, that isn't, people go to beaches for different reasons than they go to Yosemite.
Yeah, that's for sure.
I think beaches are, have a culture of their own.
Yeah, they do, and part of it is that there's the aesthetic that kind of, I mean, also a traditional landscape that is
Right.
for viewing, and interacting with marine creatures is not super high on that list. So I was having a really interesting conversation with Jeffrey Brown from Sage Hen Creek at the UC Preserve last night, and about how we communicate, and in some ways how we fail to communicate, and he as researchers, as scientists, and he kind of traced out this kind of pathway from data to knowledge to empathy to policy and to results. And he said oftentimes what we've missed too often is that middle part.
The empathy.
The empathy. That we think that we can go just from data to knowledge to policy. And we neglect to really kind of cultivate and bring in the kinds of people who can help us understand, how to tell stories, how to reach people where they are with that empathy. I'm not known as the most empathetic person, but I think
the whole science. I also work a lot for NOAA, and NOAA has spent millions, hundreds of millions of dollars improving hurricane predictions. And it didn't save lives. And it didn't save lives because the communication of the risk was not listened to. And now they've gone back and started to invest very much in how do we talk to the public about the risk in hurricanes. And I think we would find this for almost all sort of interactions between science and the natural world and people, that in many cases our weakest point is relating to the public and communicating to them, because we're so inside our own heads. We're inside our own heads, and we're not really listening enough and paying enough attention.
So it seems to me, I mean, that the citizen science movement, citizen scientists, and if kind of including what California naturalists do, in that, and taking a very kind of capacious view of citizen science, that's an interesting place now where this is happening. I mean, where the opportunity to really listen to different people, to engage, to see how people engage in these questions. Sometimes it has very immediate scientific outcomes, but I was looking at the pages of citizen science projects on the California Naturalist site, and they run the gamut from projects to understand nature, to understand changes that are happening, to understand the way benefits are distributed, who benefits from parks and nature and open space and those things, the way problems such as pollution are distributed, and equity and justice. I mean, that all of those things are kind of coming under the rubric of citizen science and in a sense, in your embrace of the California naturalists. And this seems like an interesting way to get at that.
So I think I love citizen science, and I think it's scientists have been slow to take it because they're so worried about the rigor of it. But there's ways of dealing with that. I mean, there are ways of checking and dealing with it, and anybody who's a field biologist has some sense of how much error there is even in your own data. I mean, we forget that. You make fun of all the citizen science data you want, but you just look at how much error there is in the data you collect. Anybody who's done that field work knows that. That's been misplaced. The other thing that I think you're alluding to, citizen science builds community. It builds community, and the community can extend through time. I hate in universities that we do so many toy exercises when we take our students into the field. I call it toy experiments, toy natural history. When we could have them collecting data as citizen scientists as part of a project that endured. So we're building data that is about how things are responding to climate change or something else. And we have this, we're just starting at UCLA junior field trip. Try to build community and take the juniors out to start collecting data right when they show up at the beginning, in a few weeks. And all my colleagues just want to have them do toy exercises. And I said, that's so stupid. They're going to forget it. It's not going to do anything. Have them do real think about citizen science. The data is part of a website. The next class can add to it. Other people can see it. It'll mean so much more. I think we college people and we teachers ought to, almost every exercise ought to be an exercise like that instead of our toy exercises.
So could I want to tell a little story about my experience in my own research with citizen science, and then do that as a way of kind of getting back to the question of new approaches to conservation in a changing world. So my own research, was very interested in a butterfly, the checker spot butterfly, up in Northern California. The serpentine soil, the plants that it depended on, Plantago erecta, the California dwarf plantain, and the serpentine soils where this grew. And at one point I became aware of the Consortium of California Herbaria and the millions of records of botanical specimen records that they have from herbaria around the state. And they've been digitized, and many of them have geolocations. And just with one click, I kind of put Plantago erecta in, and they have a little neat Berkeley mapper, app that then mapped the occurrences across the state. And I said, this doesn't look anything like the story, the history that I've been hearing about these species. And it was a sort of eureka moment for me. Later I came to think that, to kind of understand that the California herbaria, the California consortium of herbaria, is this enormous repository of citizen science that have, amateur collectors as well as some professional collectors in university deposited their specimens in herbaria around the state from 1850 to the present, and it's still happening. And it's this amazing resource where you can look in and see the history of individuals down to the hike that they took around a mountain on a particular day and the species that they collected, and begin to think about why did they do that at these certain times. To these enormous big questions, we recently used, some colleagues and I recently used this database to see if we could detect signals of climate change in the specimen records. And it took us many years. One of my mathematically inclined colleagues had to kind of invent a new method of comparing statistically these samples to see if what we were seeing was just, an artifact of sort of variation in the data, or whether there was something really going on there. Then we did a paper seeing that in California, it appears that over the last 100 years, species are moving around, but at different rates. That endemic species tend to be staying put. Native species are moving around somewhat, and introduced species are moving around a lot more. There's different ways of interpreting this. I mean, some people, interpret it, might say that these communities are unraveling, that the basis of the community is unraveling. But I know you have a different view of this kind of change.
Yeah, I think it shows resilience. So, and when people talk about resilient communities, they talk about how horrible non-natives are. Non-natives might be part of ecological resilience in some settings. Not all of them, but in some settings, non-natives might be part of ecological resilience because they're responding to the changing climate, and if they perform an ecological function, they could be, habitat for wildlife and so forth.
And this is what, I know in our conversation you just said, this is not an old idea. I mean, what we see, we see these kinds of communities changing over time, all the time.
Right.
And that they have, Yeah. Well, two different ways of looking at some of the kinds of things that you all, the plants and animals and so on that you all are interested in. I'd like to open the conversation up to all of you. Leela has her hand up. I think we're going to use the microphone.
Thank you guys so much. Good. We can start with some interaction.
Hi, thanks for your comments and stories. So I work at a natural history museum, and there's a lot of scientists and other people, not just scientists, who are like basically do color it very black and white, non-native bad, native good. How do we help to change that black and white story? How do we tell stories differently to get that across to people?
I think that's going to happen a lot of different ways. I mean, eucalyptus, non-native species. To many people who grow up here, eucalyptus is the smell of California, right? I mean, that's the smell of California. Different communities, cultures respond. To some communities, LA River. So there's not a native fish in LA River. But the fish are there, you could eat. Tilapia. So it may be that, that's a different view on it. And it may be the view, a reasonable view of the LA River as we restore it. This is a radical view, is don't worry about the fish. Don't spend all your energy getting rid of those non-native fish. You're not going to. They're great food for native birds, egrets and native birds. So I think we're going to have to, this is about being futurist. What would we like in the LA River? We would love to have a lot of native birds that everybody can see and enjoy. We're not going to be able to restore the native species just as you're a solid ecologist, you realize that. So accept those non-natives and make it a part of your ecosystem, and that's your new world. It doesn't mean you're embracing non-natives across the board because you want the native birds. It means you're looking to the best possible future ecosystem you can for the maximum richness of wildlife and the different benefits that are provided to different cultures.
And I think of you telling your story in Grand Park, if I remember, one time about this as a good way, is through what the Natural History Museum is doing and citizen science, and discovering new species around LA. Is a lot of times we don't know whether these at this point whether the species are native or not, or when they got here. These are, I think to open up that these are questions that we'll have to keep asking particularly as we discover more about the diversity that we didn't know.
I said earlier, there's 119 million gardeners in the U.S. 119 million active gardeners in the U.S. Conservation communities should connect to them.
You mentioned different ethnic groups enjoy nature for different reasons. Is there any way to translate that into their desire for conservation? I mean, does the fact that they're out there mean that they're going to want to conserve those lands?
I look at the polling data and voting behavior, and again, the evidence is overwhelming in the polls and in voting that Latino, African American, Asian American are in polls more concerned about water, species conservation, climate change, and then at the voting booth, vote to approve at greater rates than, particularly older white voters do, these bonds, these measures that, the climate change bill, AB 32, they turned back the effort to overturn it. All of the big bonds that have been huge, billions of dollars for conservation of land and waters and species in California have been passed because of the preferences of these voters.
But we're also at risk. I mean, you have to realize that we screw up a fair bit. SB 32, a lot of the environmental justice community is very irritated.
Yeah, and people are asking the question, are they getting the benefits?
Yeah,
they voted for it. Are their communities getting the benefits? And those are real questions that we really have to address, and that are being asked seriously now. And I think it's part of what we all have to take very seriously and engage with, is that we can't just keep depending and asking for people to vote for these things if they don't see the benefits in their lives. And I think making those connections also starting where people live, and then it opens up the rest of the world, the rest of the state.
Hi. Two big issues that I have some experience with work, but also think about a bit is, one, the whole shift or attempted shift to building up, not out, and the resistance of certain elected officials and decision-making staff that even though it might cost more money, even though it's worse for the environment and people's health, it's a right or it's culture. How to change that in sort of a new approach to conservation, and also related to that, maybe an increasing idea that's getting into the environmental community's heads that numbers don't seem to matter on certain issues. For example, climate change, the evidence is there, but people being presented with evidence, it doesn't change their minds, and they may cling closer to beliefs that are not supported by evidence. How to deal with those sorts of large, big picture factors in a new approach to conservation? Just wondering.
I'll do two quick. You're very right about the up versus spread. And that's in every city. I live in Seattle, in Capitol Hill, which is a very hipster community. They had a thing where you could only build up to 4 stories. There was basically an education campaign that shifted what was the cool hip idea to being building up. It took a while, but they changed the whole zoning laws in Seattle for that. It took a real campaign to do it. On your climate, I think you're going to see. I'm very actually optimistic about climate. The public now believes that climate change is man-made. They do. The difference is what we should do about it. And the research that you're pointing to, I know that. Everybody's read it, has thought about it, is processing it. And there's people devising strategies. We work a lot with different Hollywood studios. There's it sounds silly, but movies could be powerful that are thinking about this question. I think within the next 3 years, we'll have climate action, broadly. I think we've passed the tipping point.
So I come back to the question about empathy. So and what the research on climate change communication shows is that you can shovel facts at people as fast as you want, and what people generally do is they'll take a new fact and they'll incorporate it into what folks who study this call a frame. Their existing kind of worldview, how they see the world. It's very easy to incorporate new facts in it and to into an existing narrative. And so sometimes, a recent paper showed that if you can take the same facts and give them to people, and it will actually increase the polarization. So the same facts will move people in 2 different directions. What gives me hope is that if you look at studies, I'm sorry, I always forget the number, if it's 6 or 7 Americas, I think it's 7 Americas, that there's about 65% of the people who agree that climate change is real, it's caused by people, we're concerned about it, and we need to do something about it. The question where people differ is how important is it compared to other things? But if we have 65% of the people who are ready and willing and believe and will move, the key, I think, from reading this literature, and we did a big report on this with 50 researchers from around the UC system, and it is lowering the barrier to people taking action. So it's no longer seen as just something that's global and big and out there that I can't do anything about. Only, even Jerry Brown can't alone do anything about it. It's going to take, these international agreements, and even they won't solve it all at once. To making the connection that there are things that you can do in your life and you can do in your community, so that individually in taking collective action, lowering the barrier to that is a key to moving people. Or else I've got a lot of other stuff I got to worry about.
I just say there's one interesting thing, though, about your study you're citing that all of us education people ought to take pause at. The quintessential paper in all that line of research is this. The better educated you are, that means when you take a mathematical or science literacy test, when we say people who are anti-climate or climate deniers, oh, they're just dumb, the better educated you are, the higher you score on those tests, the more polarized you are. So making people better educated, more scientifically literate, even about the climate science, does not help anything.
Interesting. I have a question back here, and then I'll work my way up to the front of the room.
Actually, it's not so much a question as an answer for Leela. I've got a couple of examples of how introduced species are actually really helpful for the native species. The hummingbirds, I've seen them eating everything from lantana, growing at ground level, to cactus flowers that are introduced cactus flowers, to fruit trees that are not from here, things that their beaks are not designed for. They're still figuring out how to eat. All of these landscaping plants, the hummingbirds are thriving on them, and there are more hummingbirds than there were in cities when I was a kid here many, many years ago. And another hopeful sign that we said gardeners, the fig beetles have come back because 30 years ago nobody was composting, there were all of these very manicured lawns. Never saw fig beetles in Southern California when I was a kid, and they're thriving everywhere. And birds of prey are living on soccer fields and hanging around people's gardens and on skyscrapers. I remember, when I was a kid, it was like the peregrine falcons are doomed. We're trying to, save them by hand because of DDT. And now they're living on skyscrapers, and people are watching them through webcams, and everybody is enthralled. When are these baby birds going to hatch? And so social media is like bringing people to care about the environment downtown.
We should be careful about, to your invasive species so we don't leave too much of a wrong impression. Most of the examples of invasive species having benefits are plants because they provide habitat or food. If you wouldn't have a hard time finding an example with a vertebrate, or aquatics. So most of those examples are plants.
So go ahead.
You were mentioning communication, I guess, with the public. A few years ago, I participated in a webinar called Water Words That Work. And it was specifically referring to some water issues in a community. And we were trying to get the community on board with certain conservation methods. And they found that if the scientist, the ecologist, who is addressing the public is using words like aquifer and watershed, et cetera, he loses them completely. You've got to use the words that they use every day rather than the words that you learn in school. And what can you say about that?
Well, I've become a little bit notorious in Los Angeles during the last drought. That we're still in some ways. I agree with you 100%. But was also adding that we have to talk about beauty and pleasure. If we want to win this, beauty and pleasure have to be part of it. And it can't just be all about denial and abnegation and these rocky landscapes. There's got to be and I think we can figure it out. I think there's a way that we can provide some shelter, some water, some food for the other critters, for the creation that shares the city with us, and that's going to make it more beautiful and pleasurable for us as well.
Peter, I want to prompt you a little bit over there on this question because I think that the Nature Conservancy did some data on framing, and was it the services argument, or remind me?
Yeah, so we did a lot of research on ecosystem services and a lot of public opinion, and basically the best thing in the world to talk about is water and clean water. it just wins anything. I don't care what the issue is. If you can relate it to water and clean water, you get everybody. And even we had ballot measures going on. And my favorite is in Alabama, where we used the water. This was for classical conservation. This was for money to buy land for nature reserves. That's what the money was for. It was called the Wildlands Forever Initiative or something like that. It's for classical land acquisition conservation. All the pictures were sparkling water and beaches. And we got more votes for that conservation measure than voted for Romney in that election in Alabama.
But I believe you also had some data that was there's some words that really don't work, or that just
Well, so the
confuse,
word that doesn't work.
And the gentleman was talking about these confusing words. That
So
just
you're
people
going to
get
prompt me.
lost.
I was quoted.
Get you in trouble.
Yes, you're getting me in trouble. I have a famous quote that got me excoriated and still gets, and even got me people to try to get me fired. I said I'm not a biodiversity guy, and I enriched that. And I think biodiversity is a very bad word. And I'll give you a couple reasons why. Nobody knows what it is. Think about the Rio Trio. In the first Rio Convention, they tried to, they had a goal that they were going to reduce the rate of loss of biodiversity. There was a Royal Society meeting when they were trying to figure out what to measure for the next Rio. We gave up on it. We threw out measuring biodiversity as any metric associated with the Rio Biodiversity Convention. Gave up on it. Couldn't know how to measure it. It just was impractical. It means nothing to anybody. And then when I thought about it some more, just reading this essay from the Scientific American blog I told you about it. So she makes the point that she started out being a biologist like a lot of us, because she might have played with frogs in her pond and all this, and then she started taking biology classes in college. And they were all so abstract. Biodiversity is one of those words. It's so abstract nobody can relate to it. They can relate to species. You could talk about a polar bear. People love frogs. You could talk about dragonflies. But biodiversity has no resonance with anyone other than a narrow community. I'll even go a little bit further. I think it was a huge mistake for the conservation community to latch on to biodiversity. Not in theory, but in sort of practice. And by that what I mean is this, biodiversity is kind of a numerology. I have a very close friend who just passed away, Bob Payne, who used to rant about this, saying, his thing is, do you want, if you have a mechanic, do you want to have somebody who can name every part in your car, or knows how the car works and can put it together? And he sort of equated the naming every part to sort of the biodiversity thing, as opposed to the understanding the natural history and how things work together. So I could go on and on.
But do you think natural history is a term that does resonate, it's worth holding on to?
I think natural history has much more power to it. I think we have better things better stories to tell, more interesting things to say, more heart and passion involved than biodiversity. Why, if you describe a piece of land or a stream that you care about, or a lake, you're going to say, oh, this is one of the most biodiverse lakes in Northern California, or you're going to say these are the species that are in it and they're really cool.
I think that's exactly what that webinar was getting at.
Right.
Okay, my comment is also about communication. My question is, are you encouraging people to think outside the box in terms of communicating with diverse numbers of people and population? And my example is in the city of Temecula, where I'm from, there's a duck pond at the center of the city, and I frequently go there, but I've never seen more than 5 or 10 people there. But on this particular night in the summer, I walked down there with my daughter, and there was 250, 300 people milling around with Pokemon Go. And so I'm wondering if we can connect some way with things that actually engage people in new and exciting ways that would bring them into this natural science community and
Yeah, so we were thrilled when Peter came from the Nature Conservancy to UCLA for a lot of reasons. I mean, one reason is that he has said that communication's at the center of what we do, that even in the science, that communicating about it is what can increase support for your research, for your work. And we've recently, we're actually just launching this fall, a laboratory for environmental narrative strategies, or LENS, at UCLA, which is really going to focus on telling new stories about people and the environment in a changing world, and telling stories that haven't been told from diverse cultural perspectives that haven't been told, and so content, but also form, genre, across media, writing, social media, photography, art, movies, games. So Pokemon Go is like is an extraordinary example. I've done a lot of research on social media, and and social media in parks around California, and I went and presented this research to a deputy director of the National Park Service, and the National Park Service's 100th anniversary. It's been very concerned with communicating, and I said, there are already all kinds of people. You will see all of California in California's parks if you look at social media, and they're doing all the things you think, sharing, selfies, landscapes, all kinds of interesting, diverse things. And she said to me, she said, yeah, it's like people are having a party over there, and we're not going to the party. So in some ways, I think what we see is there's already a party happening, and we don't have to necessarily gin that party up, or create new ways. We just have to figure out how to go to the party and bring something interesting.
John, I want to pass it to Kanishi, who's here from iNaturalist, to sort of riff a little bit on Pokemon Go and new technologies, and then he has another question for you.
I don't really know what you wanted me to say, Adina, but yeah. So for those of you guys who haven't tried it, iNaturalist is a little bit like an app that is like Pokemon Go. You go out and you take observations of species. And
Unfortunately, it's not quite as big globally.
Correct. Yes. We don't quite have the numbers, although Pokemon doesn't really have the numbers that it had in June either. It's kind of tanking. Maybe not tanking, but decreasing. I just wanted to say that we are working on sort of incorporating more gamified elements into iNaturalist. There's definitely a lot of challenges. Pokemon was originally designed by Japanese game designers who loved bugs. I mean, those of you guys have been talked to any Japanese naturalists, there's lots of cool bugs, and they love bugs, and they've been investigating and been curious about bugs for a long time. So Pokemon was made with naturalists in mind as inspiration, and now we find ourselves turning around looking to Pokemon for inspiration about how to connect people to actual bugs. I think that one of the biggest challenges is that games have to be simplified to be accessible to wide numbers of people, and nature is largely not simple. It's very complicated. There's way more actual bugs than there are Pokemon. They're much. For me, playing Pokemon, one of the things is like, oh, I'm going around and looking for Pokemon, and there's Pikachu, sweet. I'll throw my ball at Pikachu and get Pikachu. In nature, it's like what is that? I think it could be a bug, and that means it's one of like 20,000 things. There's a steeper learning curve. So, but I wanted to say that we are looking into ways of sort of giving people more structure in their natural history explorations, maybe giving them specific things to look for, but also things that tie into actual scientific goals. So we might, we at iNaturalist know what taxa, what species are going underobserved and where we don't have data for them. Like maybe we don't know if there are any turkey vultures here at Pali because there's no data. So we could say like, hey everyone, we can tell by your phone that you're at Pali. Why don't you look for a turkey vulture? So there's many ways of going about it, and we're kind of investigating. Can I ask my question? Yeah, I had another question. So I have to admit that I'm kind of one of these curmudgeonly environmentalists who's boo-boo, the world is ending, et cetera. But I admit that it's a limited.
You look kind of happy.
Huh? Sorry. It's all an act. Oftentimes when I hear these kinds of things, like we have to be more positive in our communications, we can't be such doomsayers, no one wants to hear it anymore, it doesn't have broad outreach capabilities. I often get the feeling that we're also trying to deny all of these negative outcomes and ignore them. I've actually literally had conversations at my institution at the California Academy of Sciences in like exhibit planning where an idea would come up and get shut down in a meeting for being too negative. So my question is, do you guys have recommendations or experience and stories about situations in which you used positivity as a hook, but somehow worked in constructive negativity into your communication?
Yeah, I do.
I know it's kind of funny, but like I feel like it's important.
Yeah. I had the opportunity to moderate a panel with Jerry Brown and some nuclear physicists and some disarmament folks at Stanford right before his reelection. And Jerry Brown is super concerned about the end of the world, as you may know, and on a variety of levels, climate change being one of them, but nuclear proliferation being another, and possibly being within range of North Korea, for example. So these are very real, and he was saying we need to talk about these things. Leaders need to talk about these things in public. And they don't like to because there's these big threats, and voters don't like to hear them, et cetera. And when I asked him if he was talking about them, he said he didn't want to talk about them before the election either. But after the election, you may have noticed that he started talking about them a lot. So I wrote an essay for the San Francisco Chronicle called "The California Way: Sunny with a Chance of Apocalypse." That I think Jerry Brown has been a genius at this. And so he came out early in that year, and then as we were in the drought, as spring came, the first fires were coming, and he started talking about climate change literally as the apocalypse, as an existential threat. And he said there are signs around us. You can see it, with the fires that were starting earlier in the year, with our drought. Now, this is a very common way of thinking about dystopias or about the apocalypse. Is one of the functions of that kind of science fiction is to imagine a future for which we are the past, and we don't want that future to happen. So we got to do something. Now, that's all well and good with kind of apocalyptic things so far, but the genius of Jerry Brown was then, he said, and here's what you can do about it, in my view, and and it used the bully pulpit of the storytelling of the governor's office, but also the whole machinery of the state, of course, to establish conservation goals in communities and cities around California. And what did Californians do? They stepped up. Conserved 25% more water than they had in previous years. And so I think the key here is not to say, like, don't ever talk about, the real crises that we're facing, but always think about how can you make it so that people can change, that they can do something positive to make that, that apocalypse not be our future.
Jon,
I have a
Peter,
totally orthogonal answer. I think John's right, but I think there's another reason. Part of the problem is, for a lot of people, their lives have gotten better. So if you just did this, if you look at the global poverty rate is cut in half in the last 20, 30 years. That's an astonishing accomplishment. And that matters to a lot of people. And water in the U.S. is cleaner. That matters to a lot of people. There's more tolerance in the U.S. now than there's ever been. I mean, my kids grew up and do things that are tolerant of people that my parents wouldn't let me be tolerant of. And it's more, you can also take the ploy I often take is humanity's made huge progress. We're the lifespan is increasing. You know, if you're 20 years old now, half of you are going to live to be 100. You know, poverty's declining. All these things have gotten better. But in that process, we're putting this other part of the world at risk. So that's sort of different than just drawing attention. The problem with the doom and gloom is to make humans seem like we're so stupid and we can't solve anything and we do everything wrong. And it's not that. We've made great progress. It's come from some sacrifice in the natural world. It's now time to take care of the natural world.
Thank you. I want to get one more comment. I also want to thank Kenichi, founder and developer of iNaturalist from its very inception. Peter Alagona, and then we're going to go to Sabrina, and then back to you two in the front to close us out. Thank you.
So I had an opportunity a couple weeks ago to attend an urban ecology workshop in Switzerland. And as often happens when you travel to a different place, it opens your eyes. And I guess I'm wondering, when we talk about new approaches to conservation, there are approaches that are being applied elsewhere that might be effective here that we're either not aware of or we could stand to learn from. Both of you are well-traveled and have seen conservation go on in a lot of other places. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about ideas that we should really be importing to the U.S. and adapting for our own purposes that we're not doing as of yet because, you know, as Americans, we tend to be a little American-centric.
Europe is a good place to go for urban conservation. Now, Europe's been way ahead on urban conservation. You go to many cities in Europe, and you can go, you know, from the center of the city for 16 miles or something like that, and feel like you're in a park. But one of the things they do really well is they repurpose lands for conservation. The airport outside Berlin. So the notion of massively repurposing land for nature is something I don't think we do it. We do it for army bases. But there's lots of other repurposing of land, urban, at a scale that they do in Europe that I don't think we've done here.
And I would just say people should, if you didn't catch Peter's presentation on bringing the grizzly bear back to California, it was awesome. And although he's being very careful about whether he thinks it's a good idea, it was pretty clear to me that it seems like a good idea. I know there's much more, as we like to recur to, as academics, it's complicated, but and more research needed. But it was very inspiring in looking at the example of grizzly bears, brown bears and wolves. In Europe, in places that are more densely populated than California, that's the kind of interesting contrast. I think, in Italy, which is one of your examples, a great book written by a colleague about how the meaning of restoration means different things in different places. So he looked at Italy, where restoration means restoring people's connections to the land. And in the United States, where restoration has often meant taking people out of the picture. And and I'm a big fan of I love spending time in the wilderness, and so I'm not saying this is an either or, but it's important to to see those differences and realize that. This is one of the great things about studying history, as Peter knows, that past as a foreign country, they did things differently there. We can really learn about the differences, the diverse possibilities of people by looking at other places, other cultures, but also looking at history. And we see, in my travels, I've seen similar kinds of ideas at work in the Amazon, for example, where people being part of, restoring people's connections to the landscape and honoring those, and indigenous people is an important part of a vision for the future.
Quick factoid from Sabrina.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, maybe this is adding a positive note, but in fact, I've been doing the fish surveys in the LA River. We did find a California killifish in Sepulveda Basin on our last survey.
Yay.
There are many native species in the lower LA River as well as in the upper watershed, and we're doing that all with a team of volunteer anglers.
And are we going to get steelhead back?
No.
Do you Peter, any last thoughts?
Right, so we're turning it back to you guys then. Thank you.
So my last story I'd like to say, which I encourage everybody who's looking out at you guys, you're all the same tribe. I just have to look at how many beards and caps and jeans and people, you know, the way you're dressed. You're all the same tribe. The three things that had the most impact on me when I worked for NOAA, having to talk about salmon conservation to the farmers, and having to do town hall meetings and be the only person there, and just, that was touch and go. At Nature Conservancy, they sent me to talk to big oil-bearing CEOs who didn't believe in anything about climate change, and I'd be thrown into a room with them and say, talk to them. And then the last one was, we had the idea of Nature Conservancy, we needed to connect to urban populations. So, and they were trying to reach a different clientele. So I had to go one night to a hip gay bar that was just, you couldn't find anything that was less of the tribe of sort of nature, and talk to them about the value of nature. And I think if you really want to have an impact, put yourself in the most uncomfortable, I'm serious, you live in a comfort zone. Get out there and try to reach audiences that are so unlike you. You will fail, but you'll get smarter from it. You will fail, but we talk to each other too much.
So I want to end by, as we often do, disagreeing a little bit with Peter, since I've been here since last night. Peter is just here. I hope a lot of you will come up and talk with both of us as we're here through the evening and through dinner. You know, I've been wandering around, talking with a lot of people and listening, and I think in many ways you are part of this tribe of California naturalists, but I also see, looking out and having talked with people and had dinner with people, that there's a remarkable diversity in this room, and I think, you know, that the California Naturalist has, you know, the organization has done a really good job of moving down that path, of taking it seriously, of realizing, you know, the importance of it. So for me, while, you know, you might not be a perfectly representative picture of California, I see, looking out at you, I see California. And I come back to what I said at the beginning, that I think that there's a really interesting, important role that I think you and this organization, tribe, if you will, can play in connecting the generations that I see in this room, the different kinds of people, the different places you've come from, the different stories you have to tell about how and you got involved and why this is important to you. And I think, you know, in looking at the big picture of not just getting to those conservation outcomes that Mary Ellen Hannibal said are so important for us to get to, and I agree with that, and thinking about how this work can lead to those conservation successes, but also to that big picture of how do we create a really vibrant, thriving, inclusive conservation and environmental movement in California for the 21st century. I look to you to help do that.
Thank you all.